I'm very excited to have with us Deb Rudnick from the Climate Change Advisory Committee on Bainbridge Island. And she's here to speak with us today about climate change and the city's action plan. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic over to Deb. And Deb, if you want to just tell us a bit more about yourself and what you've been up to.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me this morning. I'm really excited to be here with you. My name is Deb, and just to tell you a little bit more about me. So I have been a member of the Climate Change Advisory Committee since its inception in 2017. My background is in environmental science. I have a doctorate in environmental science, and I've worked in a whole bunch of different areas around that issue. I originally grew up on the East Coast, but moved out here in 2003. So I've been on Bainbridge for nearly 20 years now. I do currently work for the school district as my day job. I'm the K-5 science coordinator there. So when I'm not doing this climate stuff, that's what I'm about. But yep, most of my life is around science. So I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you about the Climate Action Plan that was just adopted by our City Council. And I'm going to go ahead and turn on my presentation. And let's see. Dun, dun, dun. Oh, here we go. See if this works for you. All right. Can you all see that? You're gonna have to just give me a thumbs up.
Looks good.
Okay, great. So in order for me to show this to you, I think I'm just not going to be able to see you simultaneously. I apologize, just the vagaries of my laptop. But just holler if suddenly you don't see me or something goes awry, and I'm happy to get out of this. So I'm going to talk to you today about the climate crisis and our island and a plan for action. And as I mentioned, I'm a member of the Climate Change Advisory Committee that was put together in 2017 by Bainbridge City Council. And we are going to start by zooming way out beyond the 10,000 foot level all the way to the 100-kilometer level and sit at the edge of our atmosphere, because this is what it's all about. Climate change is fundamentally about the greenhouse gases that we are emitting into our atmosphere and have been for about 150 years now. And so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what that means fundamentally, just to get us all oriented. And then I'll talk to you, we'll zoom down to Bainbridge and talk more specifically about what our community's role is in this issue. So you're probably familiar with the greenhouse effect. And essentially it's what lets us live on Earth. So because we have an atmosphere, that atmosphere traps some of the warmth from our sun. And some of it escapes back into space. So if we didn't have that atmosphere, it would be extremely, extremely cold here. And life would have evolved very differently than it has today. The issue comes from the fact that this balance is changing in terms of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And so if we look back in time using technology available to us now, such as ice cores, if we look back at concentrations of carbon dioxide gases in our atmosphere, you can see that this graph is showing us that over the last several cycles of ice ages, so 800,000 years going back or so, there has certainly been variability in greenhouse gases over time. It has fluctuated between somewhere around 150 and 300 parts per million in our atmosphere. Carbon dioxide being one of the main greenhouse gases, the one we tend to measure. There are several others as well. But if we look more recently, since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution and when we started burning fossil fuels, there has been a real shift in our greenhouse gas concentrations. So this graph is showing us up until 2014, but I have added in right here at the top what our current concentration is of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere as of mid-December 2020. And we are at around 415 parts per million. That change from about 150 years ago is a larger shift than we have seen in any of our previous cycles of ice ages on this planet. And that is really significant. The reason it is really significant is because changes in carbon dioxide in our atmosphere translate into really significant changes in our weather and our temperature, in our ocean and how it behaves, and all kinds of other repercussions for how climate functions on our planet as a result of these changes in gas.
Deb, I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Nope, that's fine.
I just, it looks like we're still seeing the first page of the presentation. So I'm wondering.
Does this help? Are you seeing anything different here?
Looks like we're still seeing the first page.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for letting me know. This is very frustrating. Hang on. Let me try this another way.
That is just fine.
Let's see. All right. Entire screen. Here we go. What about now?
Okay, now it looks like we're seeing it, and I'm seeing some thumbs up from folks. So I think there we go. Thank you. Sorry to
say all this, but you didn't get any of the graphic information to go along with it. Okay, so I am sorry about that. I will just back up and show you quickly those graphics so you're not hearing me in a vacuum of all that information. But basically, I'm just trying to talk to you about the greenhouse effect on our planet and then these changes in carbon dioxide that I mentioned that we can measure really clearly over time. And you can see that in this graph that we are now shooting up in terms of carbon dioxide concentrations. So you're seeing now when I'm moving forward?
Yeah, looks good. Still
okay, great.
Good.
I'm going to leave it just like this, even though I know it's in PowerPoint mode, so I don't mess with anything.
That's fine.
Okay, so one of those obvious links between increases in greenhouse gases is to temperature and rising temperatures. And that doesn't mean that it's uniformly the case across the Earth that temperature is increasing. In fact, it's increasing in some parts of the Earth much faster than others. You may be aware that the Arctic is experiencing particularly rapid warming. But in general, there is a pretty darn good correlation between changes in surface temperature of the planet and changes in greenhouse gases. We're seeing an increase in both over time. We've been able to track that quite clearly. What does this mean in terms of climate change? Well, for our region, for the Pacific Northwest, it means many things. Some of these things we're already starting to see, and you're probably well aware of them. We are seeing and are likely to continue to see drier summers, wetter winters, more extremes in our events, and there's a number of reasons for that. And very importantly, we are likely to experience a real shift in our hydrology, so how rain falls on the state. And on Bainbridge, where we don't get a lot of snowfall normally, that may not be as visible, but it's certainly going to be visible in the Cascades and the Olympics as we see a shift towards more rain and less snow. This has really meaningful consequences for things like storage of water for Seattle and for big cities, or availability of water for agriculture. So we know that climate change has some really serious implications. And of course, Bainbridge is not left out of this. And we do expect and are seeing some real shifts and impacts that we need to start being aware of, and we need to really respond to. So we know that Bainbridge, along with the entire region, is going to be experiencing expected shifts in the kinds of vegetation that will do well in a warmer, wetter climate. We can expect to see an increase in wildfire risk. I talked about those drier summers, and we already, I mean, any of us who've been here for any amount of time have experienced some of our smoke-filled summers, which have been really rough. We certainly will expect to see some sea level rise and some attendant changes in things like shoreline stability. And of course, you know, Bainbridge has some very steep bluffs, and we have issues with shoreline erosion that may well be exacerbated under climate change. So it's something that we really need to start looking at. The changes in hydrology, the way water falls, the patterns of rainfall will mean changes in our rates of aquifer recharge for the island. And of course, Bainbridge, all of our water is from aquifers. So that's really important. And the ocean is a great acceptor of heat. The ocean has been where a lot of the heat associated with climate change has gone. And so we would expect to see effects on our marine life. And we also know that we're starting to see evidence of ocean acidification, which is a process associated with greenhouse gases and how they change ocean chemistry. So those are real impacts that we will be looking at as well. So what do we do? That is a lot of stuff. Those are a lot of issues. They affect a lot of different facets of our lives on this island, in our community. What do we do to react to these issues and take on these issues? Well, there's really two big areas in which we need to work and which everybody needs to work. One of those is mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That sounds pretty straightforward. It's incredibly hard. And the other is adaptation. We need to prepare ourselves for the changes that we know are coming, almost irregardless of what we do, although they will be a lot less worse if we do a good job with the first part of this, the mitigation. So mitigation, the world came together in 2016 in what is known as the Paris Climate Agreement. And most of the countries in the world said this is a real problem. And looking at the science, we think if we can keep the amount of warming below 2 degrees centigrade across the planet, we have a pretty good shot of avoiding or reducing a lot of these really concerning impacts. Unfortunately, the US decided to stand alone on this issue. And the Trump administration indicated that they were going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, which really left us alone on the world stage in terms of this international climate agreement. However, we were not saying unilaterally that we were out. In fact, a lot of states, regions, companies, institutions said, nope, we still think this is a real issue. We're still really concerned, and we're still in. We still want to be part of the Paris Climate Accord, and we're still going to do our part on a regional or state or local level to be in. And Bainbridge passed a resolution in 2017 saying that they were one of these communities. They were still in. They were still planning to respond to climate. So in 2017, the City Council initiated a process to respond to climate crisis here on Bainbridge. And one of the first things they did was to form the committee that I'm now a part of with 8 of my colleagues, the Climate Change Advisory Committee. And we worked together with City Council to set up this process. So the process consists of 5 major steps. The first was to update the Bainbridge Climate Assessment. That is something that was actually done in 2016 as part of our city's comprehensive planning process. And we knew that even in those few short years, there had been some changes in the science and the data that we could bring to bear on the climate assessment. And so once that was done, the next step was for the city to complete its greenhouse gas inventory. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, what that means. But essentially, it's a way for us to understand what are the greenhouse gases we're contributing to this planetary issue? And therefore, how do we target them for reduction? And then following that plan, to set up and develop a climate action plan, which really lays out a roadmap for our community. And then these steps 4 and 5 are the most critical, which is once we have a plan, we actually have to implement it, and we have to see how we're doing as we go along. The good news is that we're through steps 1 and 3. And I'll take a little bit of time to show you a little bit more information about that, but we've completed up through the development and adoption of the plan. So I mentioned that climate impact assessment that was done. My colleague Laura, who's at a company called EcoAdapt, based here on Bainbridge, actually authored this climate impact assessment for Bainbridge in 2016, and it's available on the city's website if you're interested. Basically, it takes the national and state data and it pulls it down to a very local level and talks about, well, what is likely in terms of the climate impacts on Bainbridge Island specifically? What do we need to be concerned about? What are our top priorities in addressing climate impacts? And so that was the basis of an update that her group completed just a few years later, so that we could pull that in and make that part of our information for developing a plan. The other thing that the city did was to complete a greenhouse gas inventory. They actually hired a consulting firm to do this, who's done a lot of the greenhouse gas inventories in our region. They have a pretty streamlined approach at this point of gathering a lot of different information sources in order to put together this portrayal of what our greenhouse gases look like for Bainbridge Island. So the first year of data that they put together was for 2014. That becomes what's known as our baseline, and everything can be measured from that. So as we look forward into the future, as we move along, how are we doing in our greenhouse gas emissions compared to that 2014 number? That becomes really meaningful in trying to figure out how and if we're reaching our goals. I won't spend too much time on the details of this, and this again is all available on the city's website, but I do want to point out that it's pretty obvious that electricity makes up a huge component of our carbon footprint. PSE is our provider, and PSE's portfolio, so the energy, the sources of energy that they bring to us are based on quite a few fossil fuels. That's part of their portfolio. Coal and natural gas and a number of different things make up the mix of energy resources that we get on Bainbridge Island. The extremely good news for us moving forward is that the state legislature actually passed a major piece of legislation a few years ago that is going to reduce fossil fuels in the portfolio of all service providers over time moving forward. That's going to be hugely helpful to us because it means that this portion of the pie will shrink as a result of state legislation. It's not something we have to do. It's something actually PSE has to do. And that's a great help to everyone in trying to meet mitigation goals around greenhouse gases. So that's super good news. And then another big part of our pie is transportation. So moving around the island, how do we get around the island? Are we getting around the island primarily in fossil fuel-based gas vehicles? And thinking about how do we shift that? What are the ways we can shift that moving forward? So this was the information that the Climate Change Advisory Committee took in. And then we also had a robust community process. I don't know if any of you were able to be part of our public meetings, but we did hold some public meetings over the last few years. We held a climate survey. We got about 450 respondents, and all this was also super helpful because obviously you can't make a plan for the community unless you know what the community wants. So that was extremely useful in helping us develop what to prioritize and what we needed to focus on moving forward. This all went into the creation of the Climate Action Plan. And the plan basically is a roadmap for moving forward on these major components of mitigation and adaptation that I mentioned. So we have a very big goal for our mitigation, and that is by 2045, we want to reduce Bainbridge Island's emissions by 90% compared to our 2014 levels. And we have some interim goals along the way. So some touch points, about a decade hence and 2 decades hence to say, are we getting where we want to be going? Are we heading in the right direction? How much farther do we have to go? And then we have a big adaptation goal, which is that our island needs to be climate savvy, what's called climate savvy. We need to be aware of the impacts that are facing us and figure out ways to respond to them. And of course, across all of this is community engagement, stuff like what I'm doing today, stuff like people coming to public hearings and reading the plan and becoming engaged and understanding what their role is, because we can do some of this, the city can do some of this by policy, but a lot of this is individual choices and individual action, collectively making a difference. And so that's just incredibly critical that we have community engagement on this plan. The plan has 6 primary areas that really focus on what we heard from community engagement and also what we know from doing the greenhouse gas inventory are kind of major areas we need to be looking at. They include energy, so our service provider and the way we use energy on the island, the way we get around the island, what our buildings are contributing in terms of their carbon footprint, the natural environment, and a lot of that is sort of what are we thinking about in terms of adaptation? How do we need to address the natural environment in ways that protect it, given the changes we know are coming? Waste, so our landfill, our recycling, and how that contributes to our carbon footprint. And then, of course, the community engagement piece again. So that is where we are. In November of this year, last year now, it's 2021, the City Council adopted the completed Climate Action Plan. That document is now up on the city's website for everyone to look at. And so we are now in step 4. And this is the really tough part. The stuff that came before this is actually pretty easy compared to actually doing the work. So we're excited as a committee to start doing the real work on mitigation and adaptation. And to kickstart the process, we have identified there's a lot of plans in this plan. There are like 180 actions that have been identified in the Climate Action Plan, and that's a lot because it touches on so many areas of our life. But we have identified kind of a top 18 that we want to work with the city on right away to get started. And some examples of that include making sure we're updating the greenhouse gas inventory that we completed. One of our members did a sea level rise analysis, a preliminary one that needs to be updated and refined. We have a really big opportunity coming up here because the city is going to be negotiating its franchise agreement with PSE. So that's a great opportunity to talk about our community goals around climate. We're encouraging the city to start a green building fund to think about ways in which we can promote energy conservation, particularly with an eye to low-income housing. So how do we get these conservation savings to the people who can benefit from it dramatically? And we're working with the city on a transition of their fleet to electric vehicles. That's actually a state mandate. The state has already come through and said that jurisdictions need to start electric vehicle transitions. And so we're hoping to support the city in that as well. So we have timelines laid out for all these priority actions in the plan. And really importantly, the city has agreed to put funds in the budget for this, which is not a small ask, especially as you all know right now with the pandemic and so many demands and a dwindling revenue source. But it is incredibly critical that the city's taking the step of hiring an actual coordinator, because you're probably aware that if you write a plan and you don't have anyone to implement it, it usually sits on a shelf. And this is no exception. The person in this position really needs to be a leader in working in different departments in the city and working with different community groups and working with the public. And what's exciting about that position is that there's a lot of things going on in this city that a coordinator could really benefit from. So the city has a green building task force that's working specifically on the issue of energy consumption in buildings. They have a race equity task force. So there's an opportunity to continue conversations around inclusion and access to many of these policies we're talking about, making sure that they work for everyone. And we have a sustainable transportation task force, which is really taking on the issue of transportation and how to make our city more walkable, more bikeable, have fewer vehicle miles traveled that are based on fossil fuel cars. So there's lots and lots of things going on at the city that we can capitalize on that are already happening. So I'm really hopeful that there's a lot of motivation and there's a lot of effort in this direction already that can take us forward. So with that, I am going to wrap up and just do let you know that we have 2 meetings coming up. One is next Wednesday evening, and then the following 10 days later, Saturday, we have some meetings that are open to the public for the city to learn, or for the community to learn more about the city's climate action plan. We'll have CCAC members there. We'll have council members there to talk more in detail about the plan and to answer all your questions. And so I really invite and encourage you to attend one of those. They are going to be the same information both times, just an opportunity to get at people's different availability. And then all the reports and the documents that I've mentioned in here, they're all available on the city's website. The Climate Change Advisory Committee has a page on the city's website, which you can find at that link, but you can also just Google City of Bainbridge Island and climate change, and you should be able to find it. So with that, I will end my presentation if I can, and then I will be happy to answer any questions.
That was so wonderful, Deb. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we can open it up to questions, and I think I saw someone just raise their hand. Kay, was that you?
There we go. Okay. Thought that was a great presentation. Thanks for sharing so many things. So you had kind of a set of milestone goals for the mitigation plan every 10 years from now till later. Yep. But under adaptation, it looked like you don't have that same kind of specificity, and that could be as it must be right now. But I'm wondering along those lines, are there ordinances in mind to help us go, like for adaptation, for example, like more restrictive shoreline use or floodplain clearing or things like that, things that are specific ordinance related changes, the island, just how we run our home. Yep. That will play out in the long term. And I'm just wondering if there's some sequencing of those.
Yeah, so great question. So one reason there's not like a numeric goal for, or the same kind of timeline in terms of check-in points, although in some ways there are, I'll get to that. For adaptation is, so when you're talking about mitigation, you can measure that spirit, fairly specifically, right? It's like, it's amount of greenhouse gas you're emitting. That's well, it's not simple, but it's a number.
But measuring savvy is
when you're
more qualitative. So
yes, when you're talking about adaptation, it is more qualitative. And it's like, there's so many different benchmarks because it depends on what you're talking about, right? So when you're talking about adaptation to sea level rise, that is one issue. And within that issue are things like insurance for homeowners, which is a much bigger issue than just Bainbridge Island. That's like a state and federal issue to which Bainbridge can contribute, but by no means can we drive that ship. It's policies around development and around how we protect bluffs.
Right.
It is analyses that help us understand what our erosion rates might look like. It's sea level rise and looking at our assets, our public assets, so things like sewer lines, if anybody has seen the news recently around sewer spills, right? I mean, they're all adaptation things that are all in their own places that all need to be addressed. So many of them are in the climate action plan as action items. So we do have specific line items, and some of them are on a specific timeline to the best we could. Now, again, we are an advisory committee. We're not the city. We can't tell the city, you have to do these things on these timelines. It is up to the city to take these and say, okay, this is feasible given what our staffing capacity is and given what our funding capacity is and XYZ, right? We can make recommendations. So we have made recommendations along those lines.
I think that's your value. And that's your primary value, is that you can set an expectation that gets reported on.
Yeah.
And that's probably the only thing you can do materially.
Right on.
And so the clearer the expectations, the better the accountability.
Yep.
And so, no, you can't make the ordinance, but you can sure make noise about an ordinance.
Yep.
Or joining the National Flood Insurance Plan or whatever it is, you know. Yep. That's the beauty of a watchdog committee.
Yes.
So anyway, good job.
Yes, thank you. And it's such an integral point. And like the beauty of that is not just our committee, but it's like all of you. Right. I mean, that's where community is so important to this plan, is that everybody who has their eyes on it and on the goals can hold our city accountable to saying, this is where we all need to get going.
Yeah.
Yep, for sure.
Are there going to be, or can you give us an idea of some of the specific asks for the community? Because I know, like, so many of us were just always desperately like, what can we do? What can we do? You know, is it the involvement? Is it this, you know, something specific? I mean, I think for those who are, you know, have this on their mind, we're always thinking, you know, how can I use less energy? How can I use less water? But are there things that are really sort of as part of the plan that are going to be asked of us, or that ways that we can contribute?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's many ways you can contribute. You know, personal choices are super important as part of this, right? As far as transportation goes, that is, you know, as far as electricity goes, I think we can make a lot of progress working with our service provider, but then we can make additional progress working with people who want to make changes in their homes to increase energy efficiency, right? Like, that is absolutely, consumer behavior is an important component. So for instance, I know PSE has been talking about, they did this a while ago and are thinking about doing it again, something called a demand response program, where people volunteer to enroll in a program where they might get a piece of software for their thermostat that helps it adjust during peak demand. And that is something that they're thinking about rolling out. So if like there's an opportunity to enroll in a program like that, great example of how you could possibly help contribute to some decisions we make around energy conservation moving forward. If you're at a point in your life where you're thinking about, could I transition to an electric vehicle? Could I transition to one vehicle? Do I want to think about, could I get around in ways that don't include a vehicle? Those are great decisions that can help us move the needle in terms of our transportation carbon footprint. So there are a lot of ways in terms of how your individual choices. And then, showing up. And I don't say that lightly. It is really hard if you know that we all have lives, and tracking city council meetings is not easy for anyone. And there's always a lot on the agenda. But there are groups out there that can help you with that. So we have Climate Action Bainbridge, the local climate group that's really interested in climate advocacy. And they tend to track things like when climate policies are coming up on the city agenda. Or we have, obvious places like the Review or Wake Up Bainbridge, or places where you can get information about what are the issues that are coming up related to climate that you might want to weigh in on. Because it's hard to sift through all that. Right. So I would say, advocacy organizations that are on the island can be a really good way to help you find when there are particular points moving forward that intersecting with city council can be useful and helpful to engage. I'll just add on to that, if I may. Certainly, as you know, climate change does not end at Bainbridge Island. It's going to be really interesting to see this year with the change in the federal administration. I think there are some remarkable possibilities for climate change. In fact, we've already seen a few massive pieces of legislation in the coronavirus relief package, the federal package, that amazingly enough have specifically to do with renewable energy. So $35 billion were allocated to renewable energy research and development under that bill. That's huge. There was also a pledge to rejoin the hydrofluorocarbon treaty. That's an international treaty that has a potentially massive impact on greenhouse gas emissions globally. And the US has entered back into that discussion. I think we're going to see a lot more of those kinds of things at a federal level. And we have a state legislature that is definitely poised to make more decisions around climate. So, there's opportunities all the way up if you're interested in climate. And now is a really critical, important time to get involved at any of the levels you can get involved in.
Wouldn't the realty community be an important stakeholder? I mean, as a guidepost, people would be motivated by property values, and the realty community would kind of know which improvements are good for climate adaptation or mitigation projects, and that say increase property values on Bainbridge. So a suggestion maybe is like being sure that the storm drains all over Bainbridge Island can handle the 500-year precipitation event. I mean, that's important to the people who live here, and important to somebody who wants to live here through the 500-year, or wants to move here, or they want to sell their house, or whatever. I can imagine stacking the priority of certain projects in accordance with all different rubrics, but one of them might be which ones increase property values. So that just came to mind while you were talking, and I was wondering if you had already, are the realtors in your stakeholder group, and do they contribute in that way?
That's a really great point, Kay. I don't know. I mean, I'm one of 9 people, and we don't track everything everyone else has done in our group, never mind the broader climate community. But I don't know if that's a really interesting discussion, if we've had any kind of formal or even informal conversations with realty groups. And I think that's a really important point. I imagine, I don't know if the city has had those conversations. Certainly they intersect with those groups and development groups on stormwater, because that's a regulated process. But around these larger issues of climate and some of these other adaptation issues, I think it's a great recommendation. Definitely one I'm going to take back to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you. And I do see that Stearns looks like they have a question over here. Okay, we'll give you a chance to ask yours. I know you've been waiting patiently, so go right ahead.
Thank you. Nice presentation. Very, very helpful.
Thanks.
My question is around transportation and particularly the ferry system. I know that they have an electrification plan. I'm not up on all the details, but I'm wondering how you've coordinated your plan with WSF and
Yeah.
whether that transportation bucket includes anything for the ferry cost.
Yeah, so really interesting question. So to some extent, part of that answer is jurisdictional, right? Because Washington State Ferries is state and the city is city. But clearly we are one of their bigger customers, and we have a role to play there. Ferry electrification is very much on track. That is a priority for Washington State Ferries, and there could be some really interesting repercussions. And I mentioned that issue of demand response. So the question about a ferry electrification, and I don't know if we have an answer to this yet, but it may include electrification on the Bainbridge side, right? So if you have a plug-in in Seattle, you may well have a plug-in over here. How is that going to affect demand on the Bainbridge side? Because that is a big demand of energy right there. And it does have real repercussions for our own customer base and for our own ability to supply energy. So I know that that is very much on PSC's mind, and Washington State Ferries' mind, and in our council's mind, but I don't know what the conversations and the answers have been around it as of yet. But I definitely know it's in the mix because that is moving forward for sure.
Well, I just want to say, Deb, thank you so much for being with us today, sharing this such important information. Thank you for giving us some ideas of how we can get involved. Again, just wanting to point out the upcoming meetings. I think I have January 13th from 5:30 to 7 p.m.
Yep.
And then the second meeting being Saturday, January 23rd from 10 to 11:30 p.m. Let's AM, thank you. Yeah, would make sense. Thank you. It sounds like some great ways for us to get involved. So let's spread the word about those. We'll keep that information available for folks at the Senior Center. And then just to clarify, are those going to be Zoom virtual calls? Okay.
They are. The Zoom links are on our website. Yep.
Perfect. Okay.